Welcome to our webinar on divesting from fossil fuels, co-presented by the Haverford Environmental Advisory Committee and Delaware County Ready for 100 and HCAN, one of a series of webinars that we have been doing this year on the subject of climate. So our presentation tonight is of a financial nature, and our first presenter is Steve Clark, who is a Havertown resident and member of the Haverford EAC and Ready for 100 Delaware County, and is a professional engineer and actually does energy efficiency professionally. So Steve, take it away. Sorry, great. Steve, take it away.
No problem. Hey, thank you, Pete. Hey, welcome everybody. I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm presenting. This is a tag team. Matt is going to follow up. He's in the second half. I'm presenting here more as a citizen who wants to take action in this area, not as a financial professional. I'm going to go through my journey and my reasoning here about divesting and what I've learned, and maybe some things you can as well. First of all, I think we're all clear that we're in an emergency here. As this slide shows, we don't have a whole lot of time to dramatically switch out of burning fossil fuels. About 10 years to avoid very catastrophic things. And the image on the right really shows it's not just about climate. I think we're finding in this era of COVID, fossil fuels are tied to a wide variety of things that are plaguing our society, like corruption, dark money in politics, health of marginal communities that have to live near these places. Asthma. So it's not just the carbon dioxide. I think we're finding, all of us, that there's much more involved in this. And from my perspective, again, as a citizen, non-professional person, this is a moral decision to say, I don't want to support this. And especially with Washington not participating in this, this is an important lever that I think we all have. And hopefully you guys would take some of this and talk to your family members or other people about the new power that I think we have to vote with our money as well. Next slide, please. Why is it so important? I think Matt may go into some data showing it's actually has not been a very good investment over the last, historically, not just over the last year or so. It's not a safe or ethical investment for our future. Particularly if there's an administration change in November. And we really have to act now. One of the things that Bill McKibben made pretty good point, that the known fossil reserves that are buried in the ground are about 3 times or more what would be needed to push us over the edge in terms of climate tipping points. They cannot continue to operate as normal, and that's on the next slide. Next, and that's what this slide really shows. At least 80% of known fossil fuel reserves must be kept in the ground for us to have a stable planet. And the quote that he has there, if their business plan would break the planet, then we need to break ties with them. And that's the point of this talk. Next slide. And luckily for people like me, there's a lot of great tools out now to find out what you actually own if you do have a 401k or other types of investment, or you know a family member who does. And a fantastic one, which I'm going to go through here in a little bit, is called FossilFreeFundsorg. So please bookmark this. And Pete, I'm going to just do a little demo. Can you Okay, here we go. So when I joined my current company about 5 years ago, you're signing up for your 401k and everything, and you just kind of pick the default option based on when you retire and don't think about it. And I think that's the point of a lot of these funds is you're not supposed to think about them. You're supposed to just like let them accrue. And this is my company uses Vanguard, and this was the top holding in my thing. This international total stock market. So it's index. It's a whole bunch of ones. And so what this tool does, which is run by this nonprofit called As You Sow, is it really makes transparent what is in your fund. With a focus on fossil fuels. And if you look at this, there's a grading system. It's given a grade of D, and you can dive in here a little deeper, showing you how much what I'm actually my fund and my money is actually invested in a lot of these companies, a lot of real bad players in our not just our climate but our political environment, spreading a lot of dark money through our political system, a lot of corruption, as well as misinformation about climate. And so you can really see what you have here. So I'm not comfortable with this, and I spoke up to our HR person, and we have pressed to the board in August to have more options for people to choose from for my company. There's other neat things you can do here. So this is just looking at this particular fund. This is like a benchmarking. This shows this particular fund compared to other similar index funds. And you can see it's like kind of in the middle in terms of how much carbon per $1 million this fund is responsible for. So it's certainly not, it's kind of a run-of-the-mill kind of index fund that has 5-10% fossil fuels. I'm certainly not comfortable with that. There's plenty of information here. And then I'm going to go, let me see if I can go back. I'm going to just continue on the slides here. There's a lot of other things here. Let me hide this here. So this is this fund here, and so you can see a little report card for what it holds in terms of fossil fuel companies. So this is not just Exxon and Berkshire Hathaway and coal companies. This is like companies involved in the whole supply chain, drillers, companies that supply materials for transport, everything for these for the whole industry. And then so this is a snapshot of that, and this is that benchmark thing. What's interesting too is they also have other areas that people may care about. Deforestation, there's a grade. A lot of the Amazon is being destroyed for meat farming or soy or palm. Gender equity, firearms, tobacco, etc. The other top fund in my portfolio for 401k is this international, again, another index fund, and it's a similar kind of thing. It's a little higher carbon footprint. So I was really unhappy about this, and I spoke up to a lot of my colleagues, and they were also really, we kind of had a little movement within my company to really press to have clean options. And this is what I would suggest to people. Again, if you're not a professional, if you are interested in sticking your toe in the water and really changing what you're supporting with your money, first do a little bit of research with whatever funds you may have. What's in it? And then you can screen some of your funds in this tool. It's very quick, very easy. And there's a link here as well, which behind here that was run on Earth Day by this organization. That shows not just the power of this website, but a lot of other financial performance of fossil fuels, really making a compelling case here that it's just a one. Okay, yeah. So this is where I was, and so just a little quick guide for at least how you can get up to speed pretty quickly. do some research. This is a great site. There's probably other resources out there, but I found it really easy to use and really quick to get this kind of information. It's very important to my wife and I about this kind of stuff. It'd be a pain in the butt, and we previously had our Wells Fargo managed our retirement funds, and we kept asking this question. I'm not comfortable with these funds. Do you have an alter? And they didn't even understand them. So we got somebody new. We parted ways with them. So we replaced our fund manager. And if you have a 401k in the bottom, organize and talk to your coworkers. There's a guide there on that bottom link of how within an organization you can start a divestment movement. It's a fantastic resource, as is that second one under Deep Dive by As You Sow, that really shows quite a bit more than what I've been able to do here to non-specialist people about one, how powerful this movement is, and two, the fantastic options that are available to divest. And so that's where I am now. So that's my take, and I will turn it over to Matt, unless there's no questions.
I don't see any questions. So Matt Raymer with More Wealth Management was a senior vice president with Morgan Stanley and started More Wealth Management in 2013. Is a B Corp, for those of you who are not familiar with what that is. It is committed to social responsibility, donates a percentage of profits to charity, has other accolades and experience that you can see on the slide. I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
Well, thank you for joining us. My name is Matt Raymer, and as an attendee is our operations director, Amy Colleen. And Amy and I have tried to pursue a socially responsible investment profile for our clients basically since the birth of our firm. At More Wealth Management, socially responsible investing is not an option per se. It's not an opt-in type of circumstance. It is just how we do things. Almost every investment that we suggest and that clients own are screened for environmental, social, and governance principles so that our portfolios can be as socially responsible as practical. So I just wanted to go through a few quick things about, in our humble opinion, ways to divest your portfolios of socially irresponsible investments, but to do so in a way that is responsible from a risk standpoint. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to show a little bit of data that debunks a common myth that I believe has been fueled by the big bank culture. There's a myth out there that if you want to be socially responsible with your investments, you have to sacrifice investment performance. So the first thing I wanted to show you, this chart is the S&P 500, a very common general stock market index, overlaid with the KLD 400 index. The KLD 400 index is similar to the S&P 500 in that it is a market-weighted benchmark. However, the creators of this index, MSCI, which is an authority in the investment world, uses philosophies to eliminate what we will refer to as sin stocks, not just oil companies, but alcohol, gambling, tobacco, adult entertainment, genetically modified organism programs, things like that. And so basically the S&P 500 is an index of 500 of the largest United States publicly traded companies, and the KLD 400 is the same index, cutting out about 100 of those worst stocks. Now, this is not a suggestion to invest in the S&P 500 or the KLD 400 index. But what I'm showing here in this graph is if you look over the last 2 years, what you find, the purple is the KLD 400 index, and the orange is the S&P 500. And what we see over the last 2 years is that the KLD 400 has outperformed the S&P 500, not by a lot. It's not, the point of showing these slides is not to indicate that the KLD 400 is a better investment. What I'm trying to teach the public is that it's not a worse investment. And if we go to the next slide, we see the same two benchmarks over a 5-year period. Over the last 5 years, the KLD 400 by a very small margin has indeed outperformed the S&P 500 by a very slim margin, by a little bit more than 0.5% over a 5-year period. Very, very small margin. I also wanted to take an opportunity to show year to date, because now this is a new slide for this presentation, because given the COVID-19 crisis, we're in a little bit of a different environment. We're in an environment of extreme volatility, fear, and uncertainty. And yet, what we see year to date, both indexes are down. But again, the KLD 400 is down less, which means, again, year to date, even in this environment, it has indeed outperformed the S&P 500. To reiterate, the purpose of these graphs is not to say that one is better than the other. Really, although the KLD technically is, the purpose of this is to debunk the myth that if you want to be socially responsible, you have to sacrifice investment performance. The reality is, it's very expensive for more wealth management to be as socially responsible as we are. We do not pass that added expense on to our clients. It's an expense that we absorb as the cost of doing business, but it's a cost that most big banks really do not want to absorb. And so they have perpetuated this myth. Don't bother being socially responsible. It's not worth it. You have to sacrifice performance. I will disclaim, however, that the government requires Amy and I to mention that anytime you do put factors into your investments, such as being socially responsible, you could conceivably sacrifice performance. But when we look at two of the most general benchmarks, the S&P 500 and the KLD 400, when we look at these graphs overlaid on each other, you know, it's very, very hard to fudge these numbers. And so we see in a 2-year time frame, we see in a 5-year time frame, and we see in a year-to-date time frame that the KLD 400 socially responsible index has in fact done better. An interesting thing to note is if I go back to the 2-year index, we see over the last 2 years, the outperformance is about 1.5%. And you can see the percentages on the right-hand side of the screen, the difference. If you go to the 5-year, it's a slimmer margin. And what that represents is that only recently has it really begun to make a major difference. I can't go back to 10 years because unfortunately this benchmark, the KLD 400, didn't exist 10 years ago. Just to give an idea of how important this has become in the Wall Street environment. So it's important that people understand if you want to divest of socially irresponsible investments, you can do so in a way where you're not sacrificing investment performance. And I think that if anybody takes anything away from the seminar, that may be the most important data point. There are some problems that we have to face, or some challenges if we try to divest of socially irresponsible stocks. And I'll tell a quick anecdote. About 20 years ago, a client's next door neighbor was very involved in the social responsible investment movement. And they did some research with their investment advisor, with their investments within their 401k and their IRA and all of their portfolios. But in the 401k, they decided to choose the investment, the mutual fund that had the lowest carbon footprint. And they had a fund in their 401k that actually had a 0% carbon footprint, which is very unusual. Usually you can get pretty low, but 0 is very unusual. Well, this was in 1999. I'm going to jump all the way to the end of the story, which is the reason that that fund had a 0 carbon footprint was because it was a high technology internet and software fund that lost 90% of its value in a year and a half. Needless to say, my client's next door neighbor didn't understand what they were doing because they didn't do any research other than divesting of socially irresponsible stocks within their 401k. So I think it's important that for those of us who are joining this seminar, all of us want to make a difference. All of us want to be careful with what we're investing in, but we also have to make sure that we don't endure undue risk. The first bullet point on the slide asks, what is a retirement target date fund? From a risk standpoint, oftentimes target date funds are very useful. A target date fund is basically a default fund in your 401k that is aligned with your expected retirement time frame. So if you're let's say 30 years old, the chances are you're probably going to retire between 2040, 2045, 2050, and your fund will be fairly aggressive. And usually every few years, it tends to be on a 5-year basis, that target date fund will become slowly but surely less aggressive and more conservative. The idea is that the mutual fund is getting more and more safe as you get closer to retirement, less aggressive, less volatile, less risk. I will disclaim, as you see on the bottom of my slide here, that not all target date funds will align with an investor's risk profile. So we shouldn't just assume that a target retirement date fund is suitable for all people of that age. Different people have different risk tolerances. But this is oftentimes considered to be a good place to start if you don't want to sort of get down and dirty with doing your own investment research. The advantage of these target retirement date funds is that they tend to be more aligned with an investor's risk tolerance. Generally speaking, somebody who's 5 years away from retirement this year, maybe they would be in a 2025 fund, and that fund would, needless to say, have a far lower risk profile than a 2050 fund. That's the advantage. The disadvantage of those funds is that you don't really have very much control over them. And so if you use those funds, you have very little control over the ability to divest of investments with a high carbon footprint. With energy stocks, tobacco stocks, anything that I would consider to be a sin stock, socially irresponsible. So when we're judging how to divest in our portfolio, obviously anybody listening right now, this is an interesting topic that they want to learn about. What we have to do is we have to balance the priorities of risk management and our interest in divesting. And that's what I mean in the third bullet point. How much does this matter to you? And the fourth bullet point, one of the really unfortunate things about FossilFreeFunds.org, which is an awesome website, one of the unfortunate things is, from my research, they do not dissect these target retirement date funds. I believe the reason they don't dissect them is the target retirement funds generally are a mutual fund of other mutual funds. These mutual funds will generally have a bond fund, a US stock fund, maybe an international stock fund. So what's happening is when the website looks at these funds, it sees other mutual funds and kind of doesn't know what to do. The right thing to do if you want to do the proper research is you have to, I believe that Yahoo Finance, however, is a publicly available free website. It will dissect these funds, but it will only dissect target retirement funds so that you can see the underlying funds. The next step you would need to do is then put each and every one of those underlying funds back into Yahoo Finance or back into FossilFreeFunds.org and then look at all of the underlying funds. So it can be a little laborious. It's not impossible. It's actually quite easy. It just really takes some time. So as I put here in parentheses, if you do want to use a target retirement date fund, but you want to be educated about its exposure to socially irresponsible stocks, it can be done. It just requires some extra research. The next thing I wanted to show is this is a sample target date fund. I'm not legally allowed to show the ticker because you get into all of these FINRA requirements, but I will say is one of the most popular target retirement date funds that we see in 401ks. And what we did is we took a look at what the top positions of this target retirement date fund were of March 31st, 2020. And if you look at these here, you actually don't really see any really bad signs here. You do see the fifth position down is the S&P 500 ETF, which is in itself another investment. And so you might want to take a look at that underlying investment, but you don't see anything, at least from my perspective here, that's really standing out. Like I don't see ExxonMobil here. You know, I do see Cigna Corp. I see United Healthcare. Many of us have problems with these enormous health insurance companies right now, and that may be a concern of yours, going above and beyond the fossil fuel interest in divestiture. A lot of people don't want to own those either. But what I'm showing here is that this target retirement fund, it actually does not have a very large position in any specific fossil fuel positions. And if we look at the same fund from an industry standpoint, these are the top positions, same fund as of the end of March, we see energy as a whole is only 2.4%. This is not to say that this is okay. The reason I bring this up is because I'm a very big proponent of making sure people understand their risk tolerance. If we saw 25% interest in energy, that's a real red flag. At 2% of energy, and we can even put utilities in there too. So in total, those two bottom positions are 5%. Then you start to get into position, well, now we have to really start taking, is that enough that it would matter to me as an investor? To many of us, it does. To others, it's acceptable. Because what we're doing here is I'm trying to make sure people understand the balance of risk management and our interest in being socially responsible. Some of the target retirement date funds, especially the more conservative ones, are loaded up with energy stocks because they pay a good dividend, and dividend income is very useful for retirees. Other target retirement date funds have a surprisingly low footprint, and one of the major mutual fund providers has told me directly the reason that we make sure that there's a low footprint is because there are, in fact, a lot of people now that are very socially conscious. We want them to use our target retirement date funds because it's a good way to control risk, but we also want them to be willing to use it. So there is some research to be done. In my opinion, the best approach to divesting of socially irresponsible stocks, fossil fuel stocks, whatever meets your objective, is to urge your employer to include ESG funds if suitable. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's the new wave of socially responsible investing because it takes into consideration things that go above and beyond quote unquote sin stocks or sin funds. It goes into things like gender equality and other types of social issues, differences between top salaries and lowest salaries, things such as workplace lawsuits and things like that. So ESG goes beyond simple the old school sin stocks. But the best way, in my opinion, is to urge your employer to include ESG funds if suitable. The reality is virtually every 401k that I'm aware of has access to these socially responsible alternatives. The problem is there's not really an environment for I would say there's not a lot of incentive from the 401k managers to push these. Right? They don't make more money from pushing these, and oftentimes the executive staff, the trustees of the 401k, they have other things that are occupying their bandwidth. But if enough people were to bring this up, there's no reason for these not to be here. If you do try to do this in your 401k and you are limited to a menu of investment options that don't have specifically ESG funds in them, carefully consider your risk tolerances. Because like the anecdote I mentioned before, it is very easy to find a mutual fund that has almost no exposure to sin stocks, but they tend to be really new age types of industries, such as software technology, industries that don't have a very big fossil fuel footprint, but industries that are much younger in their nature and therefore carry a lot more risk as younger, more infantile industries may have. Determine the best way to divest. And number 4, do your research. I would say to anybody, never rely on the name of a mutual fund to know what's actually inside it. A client of ours today was asking me to look into an investment, and I'm not even joking around. The name of the fund had 8 words in consecutive order. Make sure you do your own research. FossilFreeFundsorg, Yahoo Finance. I apologize, I forget the name of the website that was just shown to us. Do your research. Education, knowledge is power. And I hope this doesn't sound self-serving, but consider consulting with an investment professional. I would make a public offer on this call that anybody who would like to examine the mutual funds in their 401k or their IRA, simply to get a good x-ray of what their funds hold, More Wealth Management will do it at no charge because it's incredibly easy to do, and we're happy to do it. But certainly consider consulting with an investment professional, because investing is dangerous. And if you attempt to do things and not fully understand the risk, you could accomplish one of your goals, but you could also introduce, unnecessary and unknown risk. That's all I really wanted to say. I wanted to make sure people understand the risks involved with divestiture. I want to make sure people understand how easy it is to really give themselves the knowledge required. And I also want to encourage people, even though this webinar is really geared towards fossil fuels, things like alcohol, gambling, tobacco, military weapons, civilian firearms, adult entertainment, genetically modified organisms. There are a lot of things in the ESG arena that we also want to consider. And also workspace characteristics such as gender equality, proper family leave. I don't like to invest in companies where they give maternity leave but not paternity leave. I think that's ridiculous. So I also wanted to mention a few other topics. All of the information about these various socially responsible aspects can be achieved on publicly available websites. And Morningstar a few years ago, which is a very common authority for examining mutual funds, really dug their feet into the ESG space. And Morningstar, part of their data is available on their public website as well. So thank you for having me. I hope this helps. Please take divestiture seriously. Please also take risk seriously. Do your homework, educate yourself, and hopefully we can together, holding hands, really make a difference, because like was said before, the clock is ticking.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I don't see any questions in the question window, but I did want to throw it open for questions from the audience. I have a few questions of my own. My situation is, I guess, similar to Steve in that my company retirement is basically in Vanguard. Vanguard doesn't really have targeted funds available. I pretty much set it and forget it in terms of retirement. So I really haven't thought much about it. And so I'm very interested in the tools that have been laid out here, and certainly interested in how to leverage to get big firms like Vanguard to care more about these things. I wonder, some of us have heard about, I guess, BlackRock and their commitment to sustainability. And I'm wondering, first of all, I appreciate that the professional presenting here, Matt, is clearly stating that they're not recommending any particular investment. And certainly the Haverford EAC is not recommending any particular investment. But I'm wondering if you could comment what has BlackRock actually done to distinguish themselves from others after making their big announcement regarding their commitment?
Yeah, well, it's funny you ask that, because I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, from Amy's encouragement, we began to republish an annual letter written by the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink. Larry has talked about the importance of socially responsible business practices for a long time. And he is very, very public about his encouragement for other companies, not just to be socially responsible, but also to look to judge themselves less on short-term stock performance and to judge themselves more on long-term stock sustainability. You know, one of the problems, I'm a little off topic here, but one of the problems with the stock market that I have is that executive bonuses tend to be based on short-term stock performance. And what that does is it encourages executives of publicly traded companies to make financial decisions that may benefit the stock in the short run, but can actually do a lot of damage to the long-term sustainability of that company. So we publicly commend Larry on this letter that he writes every year. And to answer your question more directly, the way they go about managing their internal portfolios, they are considering, instead of using ESG, I'm going to use the word sustainability, which has a lot to do with being socially responsible. A company that is constantly being sued over racial and gender and religious discrimination, those lawsuits are very expensive. Those companies tend to be less profitable because of those legal battles. And so when they manage their portfolios, they do have a great deal of focus on sustainability. And Larry is very public with his encouragement for other CEOs to be more conscious of their own long-term sustainability. So we are a fan of BlackRock. I don't believe that we're using any BlackRock investments at this juncture. That's not to say that we have not used them in the past, which we have. Our current allocation for clientele just happens to be in investment spaces where there's no benefit to using BlackRock right now. But I absolutely know, I shouldn't say I know, I believe that within the next year to year and a half, there is a space in the investment market we will want to re-engage in. And when we do re-engage in that space, we will go to BlackRock to sub out that part of our portfolio management. I did want to mention something that wasn't a direct question about Vanguard. Of course, I'm not necessarily recommending Vanguard, but Vanguard absolutely does have those target retirement date funds. They are very, very popular. If they're not in your 401k, it's just because the trustees of your 401k have not included them. They also have a website dedicated to ESG investments, and the website is very easy to remember. It's vanguard.com/investing/ESG. There's a whole part of their website that's dedicated to ESG investing. Talks about what environmental is, what social is, what governance is, and it also has it's a small list. I wish it were bigger, but it is a small list of Vanguard funds and ETFs that are dedicated to that objective. Vanguard.com/investing/ESG, or you can just Google Vanguard ESG, and one of the first few links will take you right to their website.
Okay, that's great. Now, we do have a question. Before we jump to a question in the window, I have one more, which is, what about direct investment in, I think everything that we've seen thus far is talking about sort of the profile, the footprint, if you will, the score of funds. But if you wanted to have a direct impact on by investing in firms that are doing green renewable energy, doing other things that are very proactive with regard to the climate issue in particular, how would one go about that? I know, we saw the tool that was available. It seems like it's, geared toward, again, sort of scoring the firms that you're used to and the funds that you're used to, or funds that you've heard about. Again, what about something that's really, really targeted? Are you seeing some of those either funds or other investment vehicles out there?
Absolutely. I'll approach direct investing in two different ways. To answer your latter question, there are certainly stocks, mutual funds, and index funds that are specifically targeted to specific industries. I'll just use one example, a solar energy index fund, or even more common, a renewable energy index fund. There are absolutely targeted mutual funds and ETFs that specifically invest in those sectors. And there are sector funds that cover everything. There are oil sector funds, unfortunately. And I think the best way to find them is probably to use the grand old Google search, and you can type in renewable energy ETFs, and you'll what will populate is a variety of links that will go to either the investment companies, whether it be Vanguard or Fidelity or even BlackRock, that'll show those index funds. And some of the links will be websites dedicated to ETFs in general. I think there's one called ETF Source. And if you go to those websites that are specifically geared towards ETFs, exchange traded funds, or index funds, you can filter them for various industries and sub-industries, and they are everywhere, and there is every industry that you can imagine is available in the publicly traded market. So if your objective is, there's one side of it, which is to take your portfolio and try to eliminate what is bad, and then there is the focus, which is only investing into what is good. The only risk, the risk there, which is not to say it's a bad idea, is that, for example, the solar energy sub-industry has underperformed the S&P 500 for a number of years. So it becomes more difficult to design a diversified portfolio, and it is much more difficult to not only design a diversified portfolio, but to design one that will keep up with the broader market if you really do narrow yourself into that. And that's not to say it's a bad idea, because there are plenty of people who would rather sacrifice performance. So again, there is one side of it, which is to try to eliminate what is bad. The other side is to only go into the extreme good. The deeper you go, the more difficult it becomes to manage risk. That's not to say it's impossible to manage risk. It just takes a lot more work. The other thing that I wanted to address is when you use the term direct investing, traditionally, what that means is engaging in the private investment market. So we've talked about stocks, mutual funds, and ETFs. That's in the public markets. But if you were to invest in a privately held company, a company that you can't buy on the stock market, a company where you need to call them up, you cut them a check, you sign an engagement form or a subscription agreement, generally speaking, those investments can, in fact, be highly profitable, but two potential problems. The first problem is that investing in privately held companies, most privately held companies are only allowed to market a certain percentage of their investment population to unaccredited investors, meaning there oftentimes is a wealth hurdle or a liquidity hurdle that you have to be able to jump over. In order to be a qualified or an accredited investor, there are certain, your portfolio, you have to have a certain level of income, or your liquid portfolio has to be of a certain size. This is a old school law that doesn't really have a whole lot of modern context. The idea, 50 years ago was that if you're more wealthy, you're more informed, which is discriminatory and stupid, but the laws still exist. That's the first potential hurdle. The second thing to understand is that when you are investing in a privately held company, there are usually investment minimums. Those minimums can be 5,000, they can be 50,000, they can be $1 million. So sometimes the investment minimums may be exclusionary. And the other thing to keep in mind is a privately held company, oftentimes there is a lack of public knowledge. Public companies are required to release all kinds of data, earnings and revenue. Excuse me, sorry about that. You hear about earnings season. Almost every day a publicly traded company is reporting their earnings. That's not a requirement in privately held companies, because those privately held companies are not, quote unquote, holding themselves out to the public for public investing. So there is a much smaller amount of material data available to the investor. And the other thing is privately held companies, especially for newer industries such as renewable energy, they tend to be fledgling industries or fledgling companies, and investing in a younger company can potentially be a lot more profitable because you're getting in on the quote ground zero, or you're getting in its early stages of growth. But naturally, if you're investing in a much younger company, there's substantially more risk in doing so. The majority of privately held companies never make it. And so I just wanted to touch on the vocabulary word you were using, direct investing. If you are interested in maybe investing in a privately held company, you really have to understand the risks and the challenges of doing so. Again, they can prove to be wildly profitable. They can also prove to be wildly risky. And again, it goes back to one of my bullet points earlier. I think the name of the game here is balancing priorities, balancing liquidity. You know, privately held investments are totally illiquid. Sometimes you're locked in for a year, sometimes you're locked in for 10 years. So the liquidity risk is something to consider. Diversification risk is something to consider. Volatility risk is something to consider. But on the other hand, you have our shared interest in divestiture and being socially responsible. It's obviously a high priority. So it becomes a balancing of priority and a balancing of risk.
Okay, excellent. There's a lot of good information in there. And as you were talking, I was thinking some of that risk is also associated with the government posture on certain technologies. For example, the solar rebate, as we well know, is starting to phase down from 30% last year to 26% this year to 22% next year, and scheduled to disappear for residential and go to 10%, I think, for commercial installations. So the government posture is probably going to be a drag on that particular industry, I'm guessing. There was a question from Nancy asking, how would you approach this when you are already retired? That's a big question with a little bit more latitude, I'm sure, based on everything you said in terms of how do you do socially responsible investing if you're already retired?
I think the approach to socially responsible investing for a retiree is absolutely no different than if you're still in your working years. No different. All of the same resources, all of the same considerations, but leaving socially responsible investing aside for a moment, somebody who's already retired is likely to require a portfolio with lower volatility, probably more conservative. So I think that the urgency to make sure that risk management under control, the urgency of that principle is probably higher, if you will. So somebody who's retired could conceivably find themselves saying, okay, well, maybe it's not a good idea for me to attempt to completely divest. That is, in fact, very hard. I mean, at the end of the day, even if you buy an S&P 500 index fund, which is considered to be very diversified in the stock market, and let's say you were to purchase, put half of your portfolio in the S&P 500 and maybe the other half of your portfolio in a similar bond-oriented index, these are very, very, very broad indexes, and they're going to have exposure to things that we wish we weren't there. So I think that risk management becomes a higher priority, which requires more research and maybe a little bit more care, and maybe a touch more sacrifice in terms of how much you're willing to divest. Maybe you might have to tolerate maybe a slightly higher carbon footprint. You can still keep it very, very low. Certainly, you should ideally be able to keep it far lower than somebody who just doesn't care. But I think it's a balance. It's a balance of risk, whether you are a young person and are very risk adverse, or you are a retiree who's not necessarily risk averse, but you're retired. And so you have to have a little bit more of a sense of preservation of capital. I think that the approach is no different. In fact, it might even be in some ways easier, because if you are retired and your money is in an IRA, more often than not, you really have the universe of investment options at your disposal. Whereas if you're in a 401k, your menu of investment options tends to be very limited, and not only limited, but also at the discretion of the trustees of the plan. Maybe there's 10 options, maybe there are 20 options. At least if you're in an IRA, you have a much, much, much larger scope of what to invest in. But to answer the question directly, I don't think that you approach it any differently. I think that it would be wise, however, to pay enhanced attention to risk management and volatility.
And that I did want to go back to Steve's pursuit of a change in 401k options. And so his situation that he described was very similar to both my funds with a former employer and my current company's 401k, which is where we're locked into certain Vanguard funds. And I was interested in your answer with regard to the Vanguard availability or information on ETFs. And Steve, I'm wondering if we could go back to you. Hopefully you're unmuted. Yes, you are. If you could describe, did you have specific choices that you researched that you were approaching the executives with to take to the board? Do you see this as a Sisyphean task that is bound to be repeated, or do you see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, it's a mixed bag. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure Matt can chime in with a lot more specifics related to this. First of all, those funds which I showed, and there's a few other smaller funds, which I selected 5 years ago, just kind of in the the hustle and bustle of a new hire, you check a box. There are other options available from Vanguard. There's actually about 20 funds. And we've actually gone, me and another team, and researched all of them in terms of these parameters. And there are some ones that are better or worse. And so that was eye-opening, the fact. And so what we're trying to do is educate ourselves, but also other people in the company that may care, that, hey, there are other options, and this is how you change it. And you could change it. I don't know the specifics of that, of when or how we're able to change it. But one, I learned that there are other options. There's no great, Vanguard fund that is like, pure solar, great performance, all that great stuff, as we all know. There's no thing, but there's certainly ones that are much better. That's one thing I learned. The other thing, in terms of having specific funds that are purely divested, or even maybe targeting renewables, when we talked to the people on the board about this, and one of their big sticking points is, I think this is something that Matt alluded to, is adding any of these kind of requirements that are not just performance-based. There are legal, I think, federal requirements that opens up my company and the HR and the managers to liability concerns, or it is a concern. And my company is very progressive. We're largely an environmental consulting firm. So, and I think we know where everybody's heart is, or most people, that I was talking to, but that is a serious kind of hurdle to say, we want to have half of the funds be fossil free, or any kind of thing that, we'd like to do as kind of climate people. There are some legal requirements. So that's what I learned. But that meeting is going to be in August, about trying to get more possibilities for people's 401k.
So this is a spreadsheet with the scores for various funds that are available through Vanguard. And
well, for my company, for our 401k, there's only, I think, 20 funds that are available for 401ks that we have access to. So it's a smaller set from Vanguard. And so there are ones that are cleaner in terms of fossil fuels that we're certainly going to look at. But whether we can get some that are entirely divested, or I mean, ultimately our goal and hope is we could have all of them, which may not happen, because I think people still need the freedom to choose what they may, what's important to them. But we may not be able to have any of these kind of options available in terms of these choices. At least that's how I understand. Does that ring a bell, Matt, in terms of 401ks kind of being kind of boxed in by these kind of liability concerns? I think you kind of hinted at that.
There has been an enormous uptick of lawsuits against 401k carriers and the trustees of 401ks. I hate to say it, and I hope that I don't offend any attorneys who might be on this call, but these are frivolous lawsuits brought upon by major law firms who instigate class action lawsuits really for their own good. Law firms making millions of dollars in a class action lawsuit, and the investors themselves will get like $100. But the reality is, there has been a huge uptick in these types of lawsuits. And anytime the market does poorly, the lawsuits skyrocket, and the trustees, definitely have that concern. However, I'm not a lawyer. I don't intend to give a legal opinion here, but my evaluation of diversified socially responsible funds, really, it's not likely that there would be a liability for including them. If a company were to pick all really deeply socially responsible funds and therefore create a menu of investment options that lacked the ability for an investor to properly diversify, and they got hurt and lost a lot of money because of a lack of ability to diversify, that would be absolute grounds for a lawsuit. But for example, to have in your 401k, let's say an S&P 500 index fund and as well the KLD 400 index fund, and giving the participants the option to choose one or the other, I certainly have not heard any lawsuits where there's been any liability for including those funds. I definitely could see a trustee not wanting to only have socially responsible funds, but there shouldn't be a liability for having both alternatives.
To have the choices, say, yeah. So I think a lot of it, Pete, is the education of ourselves as well as the the people running these 401ks, and having them look at some of the analysis we've done and have them play around and talk to Vanguard. And maybe we can get 10 or 5 funds that are highly ranked, and people can make their decisions as they see fit, and everyone can come out ahead. I think we all were hoping to go into that call to fully divest the 401k from fossil funds, and I don't think that's going to happen. So
I think a good outcome would be to have clear alternative options for people to select.
Correct.
So, yeah. It's interesting. We look at the economics in other workshops of things like investing in your own home solar, and one of the things that we tell people is it's an excellent investment and it's a safe investment with a very defined return on investment that's really competitive with a lot of these things. That's obviously one thing that you can do. We had a presentation from students at Bryn Mawr about the possibility of installing solar on some township locations. And one of the questions out of that webinar was, are there ways to garner local investment for that, doing maybe a privately owned, operated power purchase agreement with perhaps local investment? And that's a very complicated subject, and I think one that deserves probably its own webinars. But in the little bit of research that I've done, I have also run across certain states that have set up green investment banks. I saw an interesting one in in Great Britain about a year ago, and I think there are even some crowdfunding sites relative to these things. And I point that out because it's of interest to me, but it seems also just as complicated in terms of, and maybe more complicated in terms of assessing risk and reliability and, all of those things. But those are certainly interesting options that I think are probably underused in the U.S., as far as I could tell, in terms of funding carbon-free businesses and energy and so forth. All right. Well, no questions from the audience. Panelists, do you have any last words for us?
I don't. Thank you for having me.
Okay, Steve.
No, thank you very much. This, if anything, for me as a person, is an important lever that, as an individual, you can do. You can vote. You can do a lot of the other things that Pete has other webinars on, like electric cars, change your diet. But certainly, voting with your money is a very important message, and I think I want to get the word out. So please, talk to your family members and friends about this. Share that website, and let's pull the money out of this industry.
Okay. Thank you very much, Matthew Raymer and Steve Clark. This is Peter Puglianese of Haverford Environmental Advisory Committee. Thank you both for a great presentation, and thanks for the audience for some interesting questions. Have a good night.